Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's COP Talk, Investing in the Net Zero Transition. My name is Liz Roberts, and I am the General Counsel here at IIF. Today's session is going to take a dive into the questions facing global investors as they gear up to finance the transition to net zero. And part of this, they will be investing in new technologies, as well as helping their portfolio companies decarbonize. In order to do this, they'll have to integrate ESG across their portfolio, but they'll also have to balance fiduciary duty and their investment target return. So we have a lot to talk about today. So our program today, we're going to start with a one-on-one discussion with Curtis Ravenel, who is currently the senior advisor to the co-chairs and vice chair of GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Following our discussion with Curtis, that'll be followed by a panel moderated by Mike Lee, who's Global Wealth and Asset Management Leader at EY, who will introduce our panelists and moderate that session on the topic. So let's get started. First, I would like to introduce and thank Curtis Ravenel. As I mentioned before, he has a high-level position at GFANZ right now, and this is just one of his many hats that he wears in this space. Curtis is one of the busiest people I know. We're really grateful for him to spend this time with us. Curtis, thank you for being here.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to IIF. It's a great opportunity to talk to your members and the broader community.
Thank you. Well, let's dive right in. The first question, we're going to spend a little time about GFANZ, and we saw a huge increase in financial sector net zero commitments leading up to COP26, even more in 2022. The number I have is we have more than 550 financial institutions that have now joined the alliances that comprise GFANZ. So if last year was about building the support, what's been the focus for this year?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would describe it is last year really was a sort of the gold rush around commitments. I think I can speak honestly and say none of us expected to have this sort of scale last year or this year. In fact, this year, that growth of about 20% new members is about the only thing that's been growing this year. And so we're, given the headwinds, we're as surprised as everyone else about that. But if you think about 2021 really as a year of commitments, 2022 was a year of building the tools and methodologies to help those members that did commit to execute on their actual plans. So we produced a lot of content this year, probably more content than most people would like us to have done. But given how new net zero is, we thought it was really important to work on sort of pan-sector issues like transition planning and portfolio alignment, and how do you use sectoral pathways, and what is this concept of managed phase out to create the tools and methodologies, again, to actually put those commitments into action. And so then 2023 is about reporting on progress. You had a number of targets being set this year and all the methodologies being put forward by GFANZ and the alliances themselves. Now we need to do the work. And so next year will be about commitments, turning the commitments into action. So I think, you know, unlike the TCFD, which I worked on a lot in the past, we had about 15 years of climate disclosure to work with when we formed TCFD. We had very little years, if any, of net zero to work with. So we're sort of building the plane while we're flying. But I think it's a real testament to the financial industry who's basically said, look, we're here. You know, we want to finance the transition. We need the tools and methodologies. We need to work with the real economy to do it. And most importantly, we really need government policy to support the ambitions that governments have set out. And so finance is here to help catalyze, but can't do it alone.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense. You know, one of the things, and I want to talk about tools and methodologies later, but one of the things that we've observed is an expansion. We saw you launch a new Asia Pacific network, for example. And I'm curious, what the rationale was for that, and do you think there'll be networks in other regions, specifically emerging markets?
Yes. So we did launch an Asia Pacific network. We also launched an African network. And we will launch in early Q1 of next year a Latin American network. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, this is the battle against climate change is global, and you need financing globally to support the transition. And as we know from a lot of research that a number of groups have put out, including Bloomberg NEF, that a lot of money needs to go to emerging and developing economies. And so you need to do the capacity building, the engagement, the networking there. That's where a big chunk of the money needs to go. The developed world rather is transitioning already. We have older assets that we can retire faster with less economic harm. In emerging economies, these assets are younger. How are we going to transition them out, and how are we going to leapfrog when and where we can? So, it's really important. I think the other reason is, there are jurisdictions where people have made net zero commitments, but not always 2050, which is what sort of the purpose of GFANZ is. That doesn't mean that we don't want to work with these regions, right? It's very difficult for institutions and jurisdictions that haven't made a 2050 commitment to make their own 2050 commitment. But transitioning, even in China and in India, who have later dates, is still very important work, just with different timelines. And the hope is that those timelines will ultimately, if we can show real progress, that we'll be able to raise ambition in those jurisdictions with the support of finance being part of it. So it's super important that this be a global initiative.
And can you go a little deeper on transition pathways in these emerging markets? How does it look different? Is it a timeline issue, or is there something else? Or is there a different lens we need to use there?
I think there's certainly different lens. There's the obvious one, which is political. There's also, it depends on the maturity of the industry. It depends on their enabling environments, what kind of policies. It's going to depend on the priorities of that jurisdiction. So some jurisdictions might want to focus on transport, others might on energy, even others maybe on agriculture. And, is this going to be a nature-based solutions drive, or is this going to be about scaling technologies? So I think there's no one size fits all, but you're alluding to something that I think is very important that ties into those networks, which is that there is no one size fits all. We have to respect the financing environment in which those jurisdictions operate and the national priorities. And so, as always, the financial sector is going to have to be nimble and have to think contextually about how they engage and how they proceed. And I think it's going to involve a lot of engagement, again, with real economy, civil society, regulators and policymakers, as well as all of the different parts of the financial system, the asset owners to the insurers, managers, banks, even investment consultants and data providers. So it's a complex system. But the goal, I think the key thing is that everyone is thinking about this. And again, we're going to just learn by doing. We're not going to have all the answers right away. Anyone who says they have all the answers is crazy. It's too fluid of a situation. We're going to have to learn by doing. We'll make mistakes along the way, but the point is that we are all sort of pushing this agenda forward, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And I think one thing we can, everyone can agree on is that this is going to take a heavy lift for capital and to make some progress. And I think one of the work streams of GFANZ is mobilizing capital. How can you give us a status report on how that's going?
Yeah, so one of the work streams is around mobilizing capital, primarily to emerging economies and developing economies, because, again, as I noted earlier, this is where the biggest financing needs are really, when you look at the transition. I like to think that we are transitioning as a global economy. That is without question, just due to declining technology costs for clean energy, due to policy activities like the IRA in the US and others. Like, the transition is happening. It's a question of scale and speed. And so in the end, everything that we're doing is actually about mobilizing capital, right? And we issued this transition planning guidance, which talks about how financial institutions can implement their own transition planning. But at the core of that is the need to scale finance, transition finance, which we define as climate solutions, companies that are aligned, companies that are aligning high emitting sectors primarily, and then manage phase out. All of those things are in service of mobilization, but within the mobilization work stream itself, we're really excited about country platforms and the just energy transition partnerships. And GFANS is supporting, for example, the country platform launched in Egypt this week, is also supporting the just energy transition partnerships in both Indonesia and Vietnam. And these are all super important sort of collective works between governments, others. There's also the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative. There are a number of catalytic initiatives. There's a fast infra that Bloomberg and a number of other folks launched at COP again. So you've got a sort of myriad of things that are sort of bottoms up as well as top down. And so those are creating, hopefully, the architecture to really crowd money in. Now we got to move from sort of setting it all up to actually moving capital. And again, that'll be the focus of this next few years.
Wow, that is a lot. And we only have a couple minutes left, but you mentioned Egypt. So I think it'd be remiss without asking about COP27. You know, what outcomes GFANS is hoping will come out of COP27? Do you have any early takeaways? You know, we're now sort of in the, we're a few days in now. What would you like to see come out of this, and what have you seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, it won't surprise you that my interest primarily is around today's activity, which is Finance Day. So we had a lot going on. Anyone who's been to a COP before, I'm not there this year. I let the younger generation take my slot. It's time for that next generation, Liz, to really step up. But what we are seeing is, let's be direct, there were low expectations for this COP. And so there's a whole new discussion on adaptation and resilience, which is basically an acknowledgement that, yes, we do need to still focus heavily on mitigation, but we're going to struggle to get that to hit that 1.5. And we need to, like all things that have long tails, like climate, we need to start thinking about adaptation and resilience, and how are we going to include that as well as an increased focus on deforestation and nature-based solutions and biodiversity and these other issues that are sort of part of the broader ecosystem. At GFANS, we're very focused on sort of transition finance and primarily on mitigation, but you can't forget about the just transition, nature, biodiversity, et cetera. And I think you're going to see, more collaboration in these other, what I call related but separate initiatives, and how do they all fit together. It's going to be a complex world for your members going forward. I think the good news is that we are making some progress, and I expect that we'll see a lot more activity this year, and we need to be held accountable. All of us in the financial sector need to be held accountable, and we would hope to be able to present a progress report next year at next year's COP that shows, okay, we built all these tools, now we're seeing action, we're going to track financial flows, and we're going to hold people accountable, and we ask people to do that for us.
Thank you. And that's a very bold ambition for next year. So, you heard it here first. We're going to have a progress report a year from now. Well, thank you, Curtis, so much for spending this time with us. Sorry that we don't have more time, because I'm sure we could talk for hours about this topic and all the things that GFANS and the other initiatives are doing. But thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, and thanks again to the IIF, who have been fantastic partners for us. We wouldn't be here without you.
Thank you. So that concludes our one-on-one chat with Curtis Ravenel. At this time, I'm going to hand this over to Mike Lee, as who I mentioned before is the Global Wealth and Asset Management Leader at EY. Mike will take us through the moderated panel next. Mike, why don't you take it away?
All right, Liz, Curtis, thank you. Some terrific insights to really form the foundation of the duration of our session. So thank you again. Say broadly, ESG, sustainable finance, sustainable investing are complex topics and can go a number of different directions. In the industry today, we're seeing a wide range of challenges which we need to overcome as we transition towards net zero. We're being faced with challenges with consistency of definitions or taxonomies, for example, exclusion, inclusion, impact versus integration, focused impact, etc. We're also having to consider the ability to measure and report scope 1 and 2, and in particular, scope 3 emissions. There is also a wide range of strategies across the industry: integration, exclusion and negative screening, engagement, and shareholder action. So a lot to unpack. But our focus today is on investing in the net zero transition with emphasis on transition. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by a great panel of speakers to share their insights on this topic. Tanya Dos Santos is the Global Head of Sustainability at Investec, responsible for sustainability strategy and reporting, ESG ratings, sustainable finance, and climate action. Rachel Elwell joins us from the UK, where she serves as the CEO for Border to Coast, one of the UK's largest pension pools. And lastly, Patty Arbour is the Group Head of Government Engagement for Sustainability at Enviva Public Affairs. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to spend the duration of our time really unpacking the discussion around transition across 4 broad themes. The first one really being around the scale of the issue and the outlook for the industry. So let's start first with Rachel. Given your role as CEO of the UK Border to Coast Pensions Partnership, what are your ambitions in transitioning your portfolios towards net zero, and how do you set your goals?
Hi, Mike. It's great to join you and the other panelists today. Thank you for inviting me. So, as you say, Border to Coast is here to work with local government pension schemes in the UK. We're a relatively new organisation, set up about 5 years ago. And as the representative of asset owners with about 60 billion of investments and more than 1.1 million members, we believe we've got a key role in helping them to manage the impacts of climate change on their investment outcomes. We believe that climate change, both the physical impacts and the impacts on capital markets as we transition to a low carbon economy, bring material investment risks, but also opportunities. So over the last 12 months, we've committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner, if possible. And we've supported this with interim targets, both in 2025 and 2030. Whilst I think setting those net zero ambitions has been really important and enabled myself, my team, and our various stakeholders to really understand the issues that come with that, it's important that we don't just think about reducing emissions in a portfolio, but actually what's our role in helping to achieve net zero in the real world. And I think that's something that maybe we'll come and explore a little bit further, is how do you draw the differences between a net zero portfolio and net zero in the real world, which is actually what we really need. But as part of that thinking and our broader remit and responsibility that we believe we have, there's a number of other things that support those goals that we set. So first of those is we have this collective scale within the UK industry and wider. How do we use that to engage with companies, with policymakers, regulators, governments, to look at how is that actually going to play out in practice? That includes how do we make sure that there are good reporting standards so that we're actually getting the information that we need to be able to assess how companies are doing when we're making our investment decisions. We heard just now about the importance of a just transition, and that's something that is really important when we're thinking about capital allocation, particularly in the emerging markets. And I think finally, I mentioned the opportunities earlier, but there's these, how do we think about deploying capital so that we can support the energy transition in particular by helping to actually invest into those new solutions. So our goals that we set were aimed at balancing all of these ambitions and the real world into a realistic, what we hope is a realistic set of objectives.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Tanya, why don't we pivot to you? There are many stakeholders involved when we consider sustainable investing and the overall net zero transition. So how do you view your role, or how do you view the role of investors and asset managers in supporting that acceleration to net zero?
Mike, I think that net zero success is really going to require a whole financial system response, and hence investors, asset managers, investment banks, retail banks, corporate banks, multi-development banks, everyone, even the central banks, have a very important role to play. I think that they are integral to every single sector and to the local economy and global economy. So if I think of Investec, who I represent, we have a presence in the developed world with a listing in London, but we have our roots in South Africa. We have another listing in South Africa. So we understand very deeply those tensions between first world and developing world. And then similarly, across the different range of financial areas. And I really think that the honey that we bring, the magic that we bring is our understanding of not just agricultural sector or fossil fuels or aviation, but absolutely every single sector and every type of client. So I think that applying that broadest lens as possible is going to be crucial in our journey to net zero. I think the other part is what Curtis was already talking about around this allocating and driving capital to where it is needed most. So we know that there is a lot of capital available, and it's how do we actually get it there? What are those barriers? And what we're starting to see is more blended finance options where you're synergizing between public funds and private capital. And that helps to mobilize and enable financing to get to projects that may have been only marginally bankable before. I think you also need with that financing, you need capacity building, technology transfer, etc. And that helps to reduce the risk and improve that bankability.
Why don't we, if we can, I guess let's go ahead and pivot, Patty, to you, because I know through your work with GFANZ and your role at Aviva, you'll have been exposed to a range of initiatives around driving transition planning. So from an investment perspective, what are the current trends that you're seeing? And if you could also kind of comment on your views of how the concept of the transition plan can be helpful, both from, and I'll say through the investment chain and for governments and regulators themselves.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. And great to be here. Great to see you all. Thanks to the IIF for inviting me. So first of all, just a little bit about Aviva. Not a commercial, but I'm aware it's an international audience. You might be a bit less familiar with Aviva. So we're the UK's biggest insurance and savings company. We have our own net zero 2040 target. So, we're aiming for 10 years ahead of the UK economy as a whole. And we've been around for a long time, actually. So I was just reflecting, as Rachel was saying, a good proud history of 15 years for the coast. So Aviva, we can actually trace our history back to 1696 was when our first insurance company that formed part of Aviva was formed. So we are absolutely in this for the long haul. I think that, there is a serious point attached to that, right? Which is that, asset owners, asset managers and insurance companies are invested in the economy over the long term. And therefore, for us, climate change is absolutely a material issue for our customers' children. We need to make sure we get this right. You talked a little bit about trends. I think it's a really interesting question. So before I joined Aviva, I actually used to be a climate change negotiator for the UK government. So I've sort of seen this issue from a number of different perspectives. And I was thinking, to me, there's almost like three periods that I can think of in terms of the intersection of the finance industry and climate change as an issue. So I would say, and I'm generalizing, but prior to 2015, you probably saw most of the big financial institutions who had an interest in climate change were making kind of what I would describe as ad hoc quantitative pledges. Usually, it would be they would make a big splash. They'd say, we're going to invest £25 million in climate solutions over the next 5 years. Isn't that fantastic? And at the time that sounded really great, but you didn't really have any sense of like, how does that actually relate to the rest of their activity, right? It's just like, that's a big sounding number, great. But then I guess the second phase would then be what I describe as the sort of climate risk phase, which obviously, Mark Carney helped to facilitate with his intervention just ahead of Paris in 2015 when he was the Bank of England governor. And that was to say, actually, climate risk is a massive risk to financial stability, both within firms and within the financial sector and the global economy as a whole. Therefore, all financial firms should be looking at the financial risk that climate change represents to them, their portfolio and their wider activities. So essentially, how will climate change affect you as a financial business? That was hugely successful thanks to Mark's efforts and people like Curtis, who marshaled all of the TCFD work. And now what we see is regulation that has embedded TCFD style disclosure all around the world in most of the key financial markets, and that's fantastic. And then I think what we've seen over the past couple of years is an emergence of phase 3, which is looking at how is your activity aligned with and accelerating the net zero transition. So there's a key distinction there for me. It's not just about what risk is climate change representing to your activity and what are you going to do about that risk, which is the sort of phase 2. It's about how are you and your activity affecting the climate? How are you planning to align to a net zero transition? And what are you doing in your activity to facilitate that? And I think that's a really crucial shift, actually. And it's actually really difficult, right? It was hard enough to look at the risk that climate change represented to you as a business. Now we're looking at the risk that goes in the opposite direction. And I think that's where transition planning comes in. Like, I'm a massive advocate of transition plans. That's why Aviva's done so much work on it in G funds and elsewhere. So this is the idea that, okay, we've moved to this phase 3. We have 500 of the biggest financial firms in the world committing to net zero. How are we going to deliver those commitments in a way which, to take your right phrase, Mike, is consistent, is comparable, is coherent? And that's why we want to set out this guidance and guidelines for transition plans. And that's one of the pieces of work that GFANZ announced last week. The UK has its own mandatory system that's going to come in on transition plans. And so we've also been working with the UK government and regulators to design that. And so I think it's not about burdening firms, it's actually about helping firms. So we've made these commitments. For them to actually be effective, we need to follow them through in a meaningful way. And to do that, that needs to be consistent and comparable. And that's where transition plans come in. So I won't go on about it in detail. I think that's enough for now. But I think it's a really exciting phase we've moved into, and I think there's a lot to do.
Thank you, Patty. And I think to your point, we heard that in Curtis's comments as well around, I'll say, the commitments that have been made, but now it's around that execution and how we're able to do that in, I'll say, in a meaningful and expedited way. So let's move on to talk a little bit more about tackling the transition. So, I mean, overall, the market for sustainable investing is growing fast, and the vast majority of this is driven by climate. According to the International Energy Agency, reaching net zero by 2050 will require $125 trillion in investment in low carbon technology and infrastructure. That's over $4 trillion per year compared to basically around $1 trillion per year currently. So, and obviously a quarter of this is going to be needed by 2030. So, Tanya, let's go back to you. And how do you manage balancing responsibilities of addressing ESG risk and achieving the net zero goals, but at the same time achieving the targeted investment returns that as a fiduciary you're striving to provide for your clients?
So I think, for us, getting your fiduciary duty in place is for us all about getting your house in order. So I call it living sustainably. We can't be trying to fund a sustainable transition if we're not living within our own operations. So it's starting off with our own policies and processes and reporting. And I think it's not just managing risks. An important part of that is understanding, all stakeholders' views. So when we first sat down to do our fossil fuel policy. The first step was to engage with all stakeholders, so not just our shareholders, but we actually spoke to the shareholder activists. And they told us different things that we hadn't considered. So I think it's really important to, in getting your house in order, that you're including all perspectives to ensure that you are able to then manage your risks appropriately. But that's just, your social license to operate these days. Everyone should be doing that. It's not something you should only be starting to do now. I think for me, the more exciting part is that second part of your question around, how do you do that and achieve returns at the same time? And I think, that's for us the second part of our climate strategy. It's not just about managing and mitigating risks or minimizing your own operational footprint. It's about working with our clients, partnering with our clients to help them reach their net zero ambitions, because if they aren't getting there, then we can't get there. So very important is to work with them. And what we found is amazing solutions coming from our clients on not only how to be more efficient overall in their businesses, but at the same time to save emissions. I think the situation in South Africa, where we've been experiencing rolling blackouts for quite some time now, has forced many companies to find their own ways of becoming energy independent. And as a result, we are seeing immense opportunities in funding not only the big renewable energy projects, like a project infrastructure finance project, but also our smaller corporates, like a shopping center that wants to roll out its own solar and become independent. And it's gone even further down the chain to our property clients and to our, our private clients, putting it in our homes because we all want to become independent. So the market has actually driven that drive, but at the same time, it has this dual impact of saving emissions and pushing people closer to that transition. So I think that there are immense opportunities that have been created, and that the more that we are finding these opportunities, the easier it'll become to reach net zero.
Thank you, Tanya. Rachel, why don't we move to you? What, in your view, is the best way to execute this shift? And what factors should organizations be considering in distinguishing between, I'll say engagement, exclusion, divestment?
It's a great question, and one that we face a lot of challenge on. Is maybe in theory it would be relatively easy to be able to get to a net zero portfolio just by divesting things that apparently have a high carbon footprint. And two reflections. One is, as I touched on earlier, actually what's really important is that we have a net zero real world. And actually I think there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that divestment means that the people who really care about this topic and are very knowledgeable about it stop engaging with the people who need to understand it better and actually do something in the real world. So I certainly, from a border to coast perspective, we firmly believe in the power of engagement. And therefore, if divestment is about saying we do not hold a whole industry, then that's not where we are. But I do think that there, as part of engagement, ultimately, we do need to say that there will be times when it's not right to hold a specific company. And that might be because its business is totally not aligned with being able to reach net zero within a certain time frame. Or it might be because the management of that business is not able to take that business to where it needs to get to. So I think it's important we differentiate between divestment from an industry or deciding that we do not want to hold a particular company in our portfolio because we do not believe that they are overall going to be able to contribute to that transition. We do sometimes get distracted by this discussion. And the other thing, and I know we may well come onto this again a bit later, but people's understanding of what actually are the practices globally that are meaning that we're continuing to see global warming being a big issue, as we've heard various commentators this week. It's not just oil and gas companies that are contributing to this. As a whole society, we need to find ways to live differently, as we've just heard from Tanya, to manufacture differently, to be able to transport goods differently. And so for those who say, well, actually, this is really straightforward, asset owners, all you need to do is to divest from the oil and gas industry, that is absolutely not right. And I think we will see that story emerge more clearly over the coming years as we see better data on the scope 3 emissions that really understand what is the whole of the chain that is associated with this particular thing. Whereas at the moment we are, as an industry, very focused on the data that we have got, which is scope 1 and 2. So I think that that's something that we all collectively need to really understand and to communicate clearly. It's a technical topic, and this is a topic that's very capable of not being technical, but actually quite emotional. So as an industry, I think we need to get better at communicating these quite difficult topics in a way that people can understand and contribute to.
I think that's well said, because the interconnectedness of decisions that are made, the contagion of decisions that can be made, the ability to take this very complex topic and make it more digestible and understandable is going to be critical. And I think that the financial services community can continue to put forth significant, I'll say, investment in being able to help understand that interconnectedness better, because it's easy to take a binary approach, but that binary approach may be best for, I'll say, an individual organization, but not what is best, to your point earlier, for the real world. Fine for the portfolio, not fine for the real world. So no, thank you. So Patty, somewhat similar question, but in your experience, what are the most successful actions for, I'll say, asset managers, asset owners, investors broadly that they can take? Maybe it's kind of your views again around engagement versus exclusion. If you could share some thoughts.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, my thoughts very much echo Rachel's, actually. I think you do absolutely have to see it in the round. Again, you know, bit of a plug for the transition plan concept here. So the transition plan, I think sometimes people mistake it as just a plan for how you're going to decarbonize your portfolio. That can be an element of it, but really what it's supposed to be about is looking in the round at your activity, and it kind of clusters it into a number of themes and looks at how you used each lever that you hold as an asset owner, or as an asset manager, or even, you know, as a bank. And how are you using those levers to accelerate the transition? And so you're supposed to be looking across the whole piece, right? Which includes engagement with corporates, exclusion of corporates. It includes other types of engagement, so engagement with government, engagement with suppliers, and as well as, you know, you may also choose to have decarbonisation targets for your portfolio set within that. But it's really trying to look in the round and, you know, setting out in a consistent, coherent way, how are you going to achieve that? And I think we've certainly found that to be a useful process for Aviva. So if, you know, we piloted our first transition plan this year, and within that we looked at every core activity that we were undertaking, whether that was as an investor or as an insurance underwriter, or in terms of our contacts with our own suppliers and the companies in which we invest. And we were saying, how is this activity going to accelerate the transition to net zero? For us, that was a 2040 target. On the specifics around corporate engagement, because I know, you know, that's, as Rachel's observed, that's often what this is all boiled down to, even though I think it is just, you know, it's just one piece of the puzzle. You know, our approach from corporate engagement is, I guess, what we call engagement with teeth. So, you know, we do prefer to engage where we can for all the reasons that Rachel described, because, you know, if we just shift our holdings in a company to another owner who cares less about the environment and the climate than we do, we've not really achieved any real world change. But equally, there needs to be some sort of threat of exclusion or divestment in the discussion with certain companies in order to kind of incentivize them to change their activity. And so, you know, often our engagement focuses around the larger emitters, trying to shift them into having their own transition plans and science-based targets, with the kind of you know, the stick of continued investment and the carrot of continued investment, but the potential stick of us saying, well, look, you know, we've got our own 2040 target to meet. if we don't see any change in your activity X number of years down the line, we may have to consider you for divestment. So it's engagement with teeth, but that's just one part of the larger picture.
Thank you. I like the engagement with teeth. Why don't, Rachel, let's come back to you on this topic to kind of round it out. From, I'll say, regulatory inconsistency to the balance of that fiduciary versus societal responsibility, the overall complexity, the need for better education, better understanding of those adjacent interdependencies we just spoke about. What do you view as the biggest obstacle to overcome when trying to achieve and invest in this transition to net zero?
Wow, that's a great question. And there's a real risk whenever we start looking at what makes this difficult that it stops us actually even starting the process, hey? Certainly when we were putting together our own roadmap, the list of caveats that meant that we could say, yeah, well, we told you it was going to be difficult and here are all the things that could go wrong, includes those and many more. I think the first thing is that the only way that we're actually going to achieve net zero in the real world is if all of us contribute to it, and therefore seeing long-term strategic thinking from governments, from regulators, policymakers in each of the countries, making sure national governments are actually understanding how they are going to implement the pledges they have made, with clear policy that enables asset owners or allocators of capital to be able to invest into those to support the transition, to make sure that we have a long-term resilient power supply, a long-term resilient approach to feeding people. These are really fundamental issues that as a society we need to understand and be clear about. They're certainly not things that are going to be achieved overnight. And I know I've already touched on this, but it's something that's particularly close to my heart, having grown up in the north of England, which when we had a very sudden shift away from coal in the 80s, really saw the impact on society if you don't manage those transitions well. Making sure that we understand as we are allocating capital, how we're supporting a just transition. And I think this is going back to the conversation we were having about, is it real world net zero or portfolio net zero? A kind of easy way of having a net zero portfolio or a lower carbon portfolio is just not to allocate into emerging markets. But actually, is that the right thing? And no, it isn't, because they are the ones who need the capital in order to facilitate that transition. So I think really understanding how your transition looks like in that in those emerging markets, how you want to allocate capital, acknowledging that sometimes in order to create a transition, you may need something that's higher carbon to start with in order to be able to generate the new ideas. Those are all quite difficult concepts and policy positions that asset owners and asset managers need to be very clear about, and communicate why that might be the case. Yeah, tricky, but really important that we get on with it and start building the road as we walk it.
No, well said, Rachel. So let's pivot to, I'll say, some of the data challenges that we're seeing broadly across the ESG continuum, and that is really as part of this transition. Lots of investors are facing, issues when it comes to ESG data, really driven by multiple sets of data, new regulatory requirements, the inconsistency of disclosures, and just the overall increased macro uncertainty. Many wealth and asset managers are, setting measurement and reporting as their top challenge around sustainable investing. So maybe a question to both Rachel and Tanya, and maybe Tanya, I'll ask you to go first. But how are you measuring your achievements, and how do you handle the challenges associated with ESG data, varying methodologies, et cetera, that are still under development?
Yeah, Mike, this is clearly one of our biggest challenges, regardless of whether you're a bank or an asset manager. We have tackled it firstly from the banking side. We have started with the basics, so our own operational carbon footprint, getting a really good understanding of that, and we've been reporting on that for 13 or 14 years. So that was much easier. We were in a good position to be able to deal with Scope 3 when Scope 3 came along. I must say, we took a leap of faith, and our board certainly took a leap of faith in us and our various fund managers, of which I think Aviva is one of them. They, voted for it, and we literally had 8 months to assess a baseline of our Scope 3 financed emissions. And we had no template to follow. There was no template to follow. There was no methodology. And in fact, as we got deeper into it, we didn't even know what measurements we were supposed to come out with at the end. We didn't know what our end goal was actually going to be. So all we were doing was just trying to understand, these are our most material sectors, and then in those sectors, what is available. We leaned heavily on PCAF. Our membership with PCAF has been phenomenal in South Africa and in the UK. We're a relatively small bank, so we don't have loads and loads of people, and we really do leverage off those relationships. So we used PCAF extensively, and some of the other methodologies that are out there. But in the end, what we landed up with was that we managed to cover 68% of our total loan book, and our group investments. So we now have this baseline. We have a number, and it's 1.77 million CO2 of carbon, but we have absolutely no idea what it means. There are no relatives. None of our peers have got this far. So that's just a number right now. What we really need to understand is what happens going forward. So from now to 2050, what is going to happen in each of these sectors and in each of our respective geographies to ensure that we get to 2050. Now, the UK lens was a little bit simpler because obviously the country is that much further ahead. Data like your building data is easily and more readily available. So you're making less assumptions in the UK, and they're coming out with better guidance around what those trajectories look like. But in South Africa, we are, we really are at a loss when it comes to credible data, and we had to make immense assumptions. So, being brave enough to go out there with our assumptions and literally, showing your underwear to the world was pretty brave. But the whole aim was, this is us, this is where we're at. Please tell us, give us feedback and tell us where we're going wrong. Tell us how we can improve, and that's what we will improve on. I think if you wait for it to be perfect, if you wait to understand that perfect picture of this is where we are and this is how we're going to be, you're never going to get disclosed. You're never going to come out. The measurement's going to change every year. The methodologies are going to change every year. So for us, it was just about being bold, being brave, and take that initial step.
Tanya, thank you for sharing. And I'll say, one key thing that came out of that as well is do something and move forward, and don't wait for again, to your point, the perfect to happen, but in order to have success, and success being defined for the greater good, so to speak, move forward. And so Rachel, kind of leveraging off of that similar question around, how are you measuring the achievements that you're making, considering the challenges that do exist around data, consistency of reporting, et cetera?
Yeah, I'd echo absolutely Tanya's comments there. Make a start. So of our portfolios, we have 60% coverage at the moment, and that's primarily in our equity portfolios and some of our fixed income portfolios. We know that we're making good progress on those. So we're measuring things like how we're reducing total portfolio carbon emissions. We're about 50% versus where we were in 2019. We can talk about how we are supporting transitions. So we have some metrics around specifically allocating capital into things that are supporting the transition. And we worked with our partner funds to create what we call our climate opportunities, which is really looking for opportunities to support new technology or to support new things in the transition, in addition to assets in our more traditional private markets vehicles like infrastructure, where we're supporting renewable energy. So we've set out to report on our progress annually, and we've got some metrics that we are using, those can't always be backwards looking. So we talked a lot about the engagement and the importance of engagement. So how well are we engaging with companies in our portfolios? Have we got coverage across the biggest emitters, and we actively engaging, and actually have we set proper milestones, and how are we doing against those milestones? It's not just about having a good chat with management, it's actually about seeing that engagement achieving something. So that's all about measuring the achievements, but that is 60% of our assets. So how do we get coverage on the other 40%? And there, I think there's as an individual asset owner, you can't really do that alone. So there's a couple of big initiatives that are going on across the industry at the moment. One is ASCOR, which is about how do you assess sovereign climate-related opportunities and risks, which is trying to develop the methodology that enables us all to really understand where we're investing in sovereign debt, or other investment projects. How do we think about that, and how do we measure it? And then the other one is the ESG Data Convergence Initiative, which is across private markets. How are we making sure there's a consistent approach to private market measurements and reporting? And both of those are, I think, really important ways in which, as an industry, we can try to influence this really difficult question of data. The other area for us is some of our assets we manage internally, and some of them we're working with larger asset managers. And so really trying to ask our asset managers who've got really large assets under management to use their influence, and working with them about what our expectations are is another way in which we're trying to think about that data challenge.
Okay, now thank you, Rachel. Really, one final area and one final question, and Patty, I'll direct this one to you, but really this is all around kind of the journey and the transition towards net zero. We know is a long one, and we'll have those inevitable bumps in the road, whether they're political, economic, or other. But in recent years, obviously, we've had the pandemic, the energy crisis, inflation, more to come, right? So a lot to deal with. But Patty, do you see the geopolitical situation making the net zero ambitions, I'll say, less achievable? And how does the geopolitical situation really affect your net zero strategy?
Thanks, Mike. Really good question. I think, as Curtis said in his interview earlier, it would be foolish to pretend that there aren't headwinds to net zero at the moment, right? And you've just mentioned the main ones. But I do sort of see those headwinds playing out potentially in a couple of interesting ways. So particularly when you look at the energy crisis, right? The energy crisis and what that's meant for the cost of living crisis. Certainly the response in Europe and the US is instructive. So we're kind of seeing both certain short-term actions, which I think do not contribute positively towards net zero, right? Like a kind of a search around for, coal supplies to use up in the absence of gas from Russia, which we're seeing certainly in the EU, maybe a little bit in the US. But in the medium to long term, again, both in the EU and the US and in the UK, it's accelerating the build of renewables, because I think, all EU governments and the US and many other governments around the world are realizing that this is not a crisis of renewable energy, it's a crisis basically of fossil fuel energy. And I attended an interesting talk by the International Energy Agency a few weeks ago where they said, all the calls that they've been having with policymakers around the world, no one is saying, give me less renewable energy right now, right? They're all saying, we wish we'd built more renewable energy at more pace when we had the chance. So I do think we're going to see potentially a short-term uptick in the use of fossil fuels, which obviously would not be a good contribution to net zero. But over the medium and long term, hopefully a massive uptick in renewables. And this again comes back to the concept of transition planning for me. So what we've said in GFANZ is the concept of a transition plan does not just apply to a corporate. So everything that I've talked about so far has been, how does a corporate come up with a convincing, credible, consistent transition plan which sets out how that corporate will accelerate their transition to net zero. But as we were doing that work for GFANZ, we sort of thought, well, actually, this is like, why are we just thinking about this for corporates, right? Ultimately, those who are going to shape the global economy are the governments and regulators of this world. They need to have transition plans too. So that's the angle we're playing in GFANZ at the moment. We're developing our own guidance on corporate transition plans, but we're also using our influence with governments to say, look, you need more detailed whole of economy transition plans too, sector by sector, setting out how you plan to meet your net zero targets. And that would then begin to say, well, look, okay, so you're bringing some coal-fired power plants online, but you're also building a heck of a lot new renewables. How does that all factor into your carbon budget and your net zero target? What does that mean for investment within your country? And we really want to see the detail now. And to give government credit, they're responding well to that. So I would say, the geopolitical situation is difficult, but it's also, not immutable, right? There are certain aspects of it, of course, that we as corporates don't have the right to delve into, but there are other elements where actually governments do appreciate our input and advice, particularly where it's about, how can they get more investment going into the areas that they need to. So we shouldn't underestimate the positive influence that investors in the financial sector can get in trying to help steer governments and regulators in a positive, constructive direction on net zero. As you know, the IIF knows more than anyone, because I know they play that kind of positive role internationally. So let's keep doing that. Let's keep pushing for transition plans at corporate level, at national level, and at international level.
Okay. Now, Patty, thank you, and a great way to conclude, because we have reached the end of our time, and this concludes our event for today. But I do want to thank all of our speakers, Liz and Curtis as well, for an insightful session. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I would like to note that there are more COP Talk sessions that are scheduled for next week. So please check the IIF website for further details on dates and times. But again, stay well, take care. And this concludes the session. Bye now.